Hello, welcome to another screencast where this time we'll be addressing the functional anatomy of blood vessels. And so by the end of this, you should be able to identify and describe the structure and function of an artery, the structure and function of a capillary, and the structure and function of veins. And then also be able to explain how those, the functions of the arteries, capillaries, and veins are related to their structures or vice versa. Okay, so here we go. Let's get started. So this is a diagram from your textbook that shows the arteries, the capillaries, and the veins from left to right. And these blood vessels, these are organs. So organ by definition has more than one tissue type. So we should see here the different tissue types. All right, so what I'm going to do is we'll focus on the arteries, and then we'll focus on these veins, and then we'll go and look at the capillaries, okay? So arteries. So the structure of the artery, so since it's an organ, it has different tissue types here. So what we see is in these blood vessels, in arteries, is that we see muscle tissue, we're going to see epithelial tissue, and we will see connective tissue. There's also a little bit of nervous tissue in here as well. So we see all four different tissue types present in this. So let's look at the inside and work our way out, okay? So these blood vessels, they are, of course, structured to be carrying blood, and the blood is going to be carried in this hollow part right here. So the blood, the plasma, and the cells are here, and the inside lining of that is an endothelium, right? So this is epithelial tissue, and this endothelium is simple squamous. So this is a simple squamous epithelium. Just outside that, of course, then is the basement membrane. So there's a loose connective tissue layer here in darker brown. And then there's this internal elastic lamina. So this elastic is also sort of connective tissue, mostly elastin fibers. Moving our way out, then we have this tunica. Sorry, before I do that, these three structures here are the tunica intima. So a tunic is a cloak, right? And the intimate one, so the intima, this is the most inside, right? So just a fancy technical term, this tunica intima. Again, the endothelium and then the loose connective tissue and that internal elastic lamina. The tunica media is the middle layer there, and this tunica media is smooth muscle. So there's a layer there of smooth muscle that will be relatively thick compared to a vein, which we'll look at in just a little bit. Then the tunica externa is comprised of connective tissue, and this is going to be a combination of dense irregular connective tissue and dense regular connective tissue. And then sub to that is going to be another elastic lamina right here. And again, this is connective tissue and then elastin. So with these two elastic layers here, the arteries are able to stretch and swell as the pressure inside the arteries changes. Okay? So the space where that blood is flowing, again, is going to be the lumen, right, that space. And so you should practice right now reviewing, going from inside to outside, the different layers that are the structure of this artery. So arteries are rather large. They, by definition, are carrying blood away from the heart. Right? So since arteries are carrying blood away from the heart, the arterial blood pressure is going to be high relative to venous blood pressure, right? That is the blood pressure in the veins, right? So we have a relatively thick, smooth muscle layer, and we have a relatively thick tunica externa as well that are able to sustain those higher internal pressures of the blood here as they leave either the left ventricle or the right ventricle. Okay. As these arteries get smaller and smaller, they branch, or as they branch, they get smaller and smaller, I should say, and they form arterioles. So an arteriole is simply a smaller artery. And again, this arrow here is away from the heart, into the systemic or into the pulmonary circuit. Let's contrast that now with a vein. Right? And the veins, as we see here, here's a lumen, right? And veins, by definition, are going to be taking blood back towards the heart. Right? So they take the blood back toward the heart. And the venous pressure is relatively low, right, relative to the arterial pressure. It's far away from the pump by this point, and so those pressures are lower. The lumen of the veins is also a little bit wider. Right? So this diameter here is wider than an artery. And if we now look at the layers going from inside to out like we did with the artery, we see, of course, an endothelium. Check. And this is a simple squamous epithelium. We then see a loose connective tissue membrane, the basement membrane there. The internal elastic lamina is not present. I should have had that erased there. So there's no elastic lamina here. This tunica media is smooth muscle tissue layer. And then there's, again, no external elastic lamina on the vein. And then the tunica externa is, again, connective tissue, dense irregular, and dense irregular connective tissue. Right? So venules are small veins. Then blood is draining from venules into the lumen of a vein, and then that's being taken back toward the heart. One feature that the veins have that arteries do not, is they have these valves. And these valves are little infoldings of the tunica intima. And these valves keep the blood flowing in only one direction. So there's a little cusp here. So as the pressure increases on this side, the blood will flow up. And then as the blood tends to come back, the drop in pressure, that blood drops back and will then close those valves. Right? So again, the valves in the veins help keep blood flowing, even at a relatively low pressure, in one direction only. The arteries do not have these valves. The blood is under enough pressure there, leaving the heart to keep that blood flowing in one direction. Okay? So we've talked about arteries on the one end, taking blood away from the heart, veins bringing blood back to the heart. Let's talk about actually before we did it, here's an electron micrograph of a cross-section through an artery and a vein. And you see here, it's relatively obvious how thick the wall of the artery is there. Right? And the arterial wall here, again, this is the tunica media, right? And this is mostly smooth muscle tissue there. Right? So the thickness here and that elastic lamina that's going to be in there helps to sustain that higher pressure that's inside of the arteries, right, forcing out this way. Here's a vein, larger diameter and then thinner walls, right, in comparison to an artery. So capillaries. Capillaries are the connections, if you will, between the arterioles and the venules. So blood will flow into a capillary, what we call a bed. Right? So capillaries here are the junctions between arteries and veins in the circuits, that is the pulmonary circuit and the systemic circuit. The capillaries are locations of gas and nutrient and waste exchange. Right? So we're going to be having this gas, nutrient, waste exchange here. So you need to be able to get stuff into and out of the bloodstream. Right? These capillaries occur in beds, right, associated with all tissues of the body. So here we see an artist's rendition of what the capillary bed would look like. And you would have then the cells of the body here. So these are all the cells with their nuclei in between and around these beds. Okay? So almost every single cell in the body is in contact with a capillary bed at one time or another, delivering oxygen and picking up carbon dioxide. So as the blood flows in at least this would be the systemic circuit. Right? So as you're flowing this way, oxygen would be being dropped off, CO2 would be being picked up, right? And then the blood changes color here, right, as it does not bind to hemoglobin. There's no oxygen anyway. So if we take a little section of a capillary, how is this capillary structured differently than either an artery or a vein? Well, you notice right away that there's no tunica externa, there's no tunica media, and really all that you have is the tunica intima. And so you have this basement membrane, right, which is loose areolar connective tissue, and then you have an endothelium, right? And this endothelium is, again, a simple squamous epithelium. So the structure here, you are able to easily diffuse gases across, right, out, and then in, as well as exchanging other materials, right, glucose, for example, all right, waste products like urea, etc. Right? So coloring book pages, you have some coloring book pages you can practice looking at the different structures. Here again, you see the veins, and then here's the valve. We have models of this in the classroom. Highly recommend you taking a look at that, putting it in 3D for yourself. Right? Again, another coloring book excerpt here, looking at the difference between an artery, a vein, and a capillary. Okay? Arterioles are small arteries, venules, small veins. Right? A little bit more about the capillaries here. In some capillaries, you see here's the endothelium. Right? These are the simple squamous endothelial cells fitting together here. But in some capillaries, they don't really quite fit together. There's actually a little gap right here. Right? And these gaps allow things like white blood cells to actually leave the circulatory system and be in and around the interstitial fluid. Right? So this is the fluid that's around all the cells. Right? So you have white blood cells that are actually able to squeeze through. The red blood cells do not squeeze through those little gaps. Right? What also happens here is that these little gaps, some of the plasma will leak out. Right? So plasma is constantly leaking out of your bloodstream. So this plasma leaks out, right, and becomes that interstitial fluid. And you're thinking, all right, well, wait a minute, if I keep losing plasma, my blood pressure is going to go way down. This is not a good situation. So what happens is this is constantly being circulated. Plasma leaks out. It's then called once it leaves the circulatory system, it's called the interstitial fluid. And then that interstitial fluid is circulated and picked up by the lymphatic system. Right? So it goes into a lymphatic duct and then into a lymphatic vessel, it being the fluid. And when it's inside the duct and inside the lymphatic vessel, we now refer to it as lymph. Right? This is lymph fluid. That lymph fluid will then drain back into the bloodstream at the superior and inferior vena cava, in which time it becomes plasma again. So we have this constant circulation of this fluid, right, from the capillaries to surrounding the cells. Electron micrograph down here of capillary right here. And then here is a photomicrograph of a capillary. We see that we're identifying the width of this here. Here's an erythrocyte, a red blood cell. Right? The capillary wall, this wall, again, is the endothelium. Right? Simple squamous epithelium there. And then you have skeletal muscle tissue to which we're delivering these. Right? You also then see a white blood cell in there. So these capillaries, their diameter is really, really small. It's only one cell thick. It's only one cell wide. So these red blood cells kind of line up one behind the other, and as they pass through the capillaries. Just a different variation on a theme. You have different types of capillaries at different tissues. This is just sort of nice to know, interesting stuff. So you have a continuous capillaries where there's really kind of no gap between the endothelial cells. Here we see this in fat, muscle, and the nervous system. Fenestrated capillaries, the fenestration, you have little actually holes in the endothelial cells there. And so this is like a soda straw with holes just punched in it. We see these in the intestinal villi, endocrine glands, and the kidney. Right? And then we have discontinuous capillaries. The discontinuous capillaries here, there's a gap. The cells don't fit together really tightly. And this is more like what we were seeing in the image before. And so white blood cells are able to kind of sort of squeeze out there, which is good because then they're out patrolling for viruses and bacteria in the interstitial fluid. You see these in the liver and the bone marrow and the spleen. Okay? So you should be able to, again, describe the structure and function of arteries, capillaries, and veins, and then how those functions, be talking a little bit about how those structures and those functions make sense. All right? So you understand the function of an artery, the function of a capillary, the function of a vein, and then why does that structure look, why do those blood vessels look the way they do? Okay? Thanks for listening, and bring your questions to class.